Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history, where East meets West and freedom meets totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times. As always, we seek to bring more light than heat to these important policy discussions. We're going to dig a little bit deeper, but in a deeper and different way today as we go into the documentary space. And we've got an exciting documentary to share with you, our audience today. We're going to hear from two of the producers. First, Colby Barrett is the producer of A Faith Under Siege. He's an entrepreneur, filmmaker, former U.S. Marine Corps captain. He led infantry and scout sniper platoons across the Pacific Rim and the Middle East. Colby previously served as CEO, president, and vice chairman of Geostabilization International, and he now owns and operates Honey Rock Landing Orchard. Then we also have Stephen Moore, who's an executive producer of A Faith Under Siege. He's a former chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives who has spent most of his time in Ukraine since day 5 of the war. He leads the Ukraine Freedom Project, which has delivered 250 tons of food, medical supplies, body armor, and other critical aid to the front. Moore has also become a trusted resource for policymakers and media, offering firsthand data-driven insights into the realities of the ground in Ukraine. And I was excited to meet Steve in Ukraine last year and got a chance to know and understand his story. And then this year I see he and Colby have come out with this amazing documentary piece, A Faith Under Siege, and I'll let them tell about how this got going and where people can view this. I got a chance to watch the whole thing this week, and it was just tremendous. So congratulations, gentlemen.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
I'll start, and hey, it's good to see you again. Thanks for talking to us, because you've got an important audience, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our film and the important issues that are around this film. We're at the Odessa Black Sea Security Forum today, and it's an amazing. There's just people here from all over the world talking about policy related to Ukraine, related to the Black Sea, and what many people don't know is that Ukraine controls the Black Sea, and they've driven the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea with use of drones and missiles. So it's a super interesting place to be here today.
Amazing. Well, I am so glad to hear you guys are safe on the ground there in Ukraine, and as always, making a difference. So how did this project get going? What's the genesis of this, Colby?
Yeah, I was, as you mentioned, we run an orchard. This summer, I was getting ready for harvest. We grow peaches. A super busy time. And I got a friend that called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to go on an aid convoy to Ukraine?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I have lots of good reasons that makes no sense. There's a war there. We're mid-harvest. I've got 4 kids. But I really felt like a pull on my heart to go and help. And once I started doing some more research on what was happening over there, something that just blew my mind was what Russia was doing to Christians, primarily evangelical Christians in the occupied territories. And when we saw this, I was just so surprised that so few people were covering this. This just was not getting out in the American media. I've never made a documentary before, but I have built teams before. And so as a CEO and as a Marine, I've done that before. So what we did was basically figured out what is the team that can tell this story. So we brought together some of the best film crews in Ukraine, award-winning folks there. We traveled with Stephen and Anya Shvetsova with Ukraine Freedom Project. We traveled the entire length of the front lines from Kharkiv all the way down to Kherson, talking to people. Had an amazing film crew, an amazing post-production crew in New York. And then really the Ukraine Freedom Project was really what the glue and the leg of the stool that really made this work, because they had worked with these Christians that had suffered and built relationships. You know, I can't just show up and say, "Hey, I'm from Colorado. Tell me about the worst things that have ever happened to you." But with Anya and Stephen having these relationships and knowing these folks, we were able to get access that so few people have. And that was really the point of the movie, was not what does Colby think about Ukraine or Stephen or more Americans talking about this. It was firsthand stories of Ukrainian Christians that had suffered under Russian occupation, without a lot of filter, without a lot of noise, just their stories. And we feel like that's what is really gonna sway the conversation here. There's just so much information and misinformation and these kind of things, firsthand stories of Christians that have gone through this, that works.
Yeah, Colby, I thought it was very powerful to watch this unfold through your eyes. In the movie, you can see, okay, you have an American filter that, this is the audience that really needs educated, but also for those that do know and study a lot about this conflict and all that it unfolds, you're at the front lines. So it's so powerful and riveting to see you guys. So Steve, how did you and your team navigate that and make that happen to the average person listening to this thinking, okay, this is crazy. They're at the front lines and driving around. Like, I know you've been there since day 5. You know how to navigate this, but explain that process, how you make a documentary at the front lines when you're not part of the military.
Well, first you bring a U.S. Marine, and then we, right now, if we drove 3 hours, we would find a lot of Russians. So right now we're 3 hours from the front. So and when you do this, I came here on day 5 of the war to help, and I drove all over Ukraine bringing body armor and Starlinks and all that. And the Ukrainian military is happy to see me. They're like, because this is, despite what you hear about the $100 billion in U.S. aid, there is still a lot of this that's run on shoestring. And so, the U.S. government did not send Starlinks, that's despite what you may hear. The U.S. government does not send generators and some of the such basic things. And so we made a lot of friends in the Ukrainian military. And so when we go into these places, we get good information from the military, and we get military escorts frequently. And, what we see when we go is that Russia has shut down every church in occupied Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has made it a crime to have a Bible study in your home, just with like 5 people. You can go to prison for 20 years and be beaten and tortured every day for opening your Bible in your home and sharing it with with 5 of your friends. And so, and when you come here and you see this, it is just so horrific. We work with a pastor in a place called Kherson, which is this is the place you would go 3 hours from here. And this pastor decided to stay rather than flee when the Russians came. And he grew his flock. He took care of his flock. And the thanks that he gets from the Russians is that he's targeted by drones. When we interviewed him, he'd been hit 5 times by Russian drones or Russian artillery. The 6th time was last week. So this is still going on right now. And, Vladimir Putin, some people think he's a defender of Christendom. But the truth is, he is killing Christians. So, and this is information. Gary, I've run Republican campaigns all my life. I thought I was really good at it until I saw what the Russians do. The propaganda is stifling. They spent, by some estimates, $2.4 billion worth of money externally on propaganda. And much of that is targeted towards people like us.
Right. It's incredible to see. I want to unpack the story of religious persecution a little bit more. One of the facts that I learned in this was 81% of Ukrainians identify as Christians. Decades of work by U.S. missionaries has made Ukraine home to more than 1 million evangelical Christians. Baptists are the 3rd largest denomination in Ukraine, behind Orthodox and Greek Catholic. So this is a very faith-driven country. Why do Russians target churches and Christians, Colby? And what are some of the stories that really stand out to you the most?
Yeah, that's a great point. This is one of the most religious Christian countries in all the world, really. As you mentioned, huge majority Christian population. When the wall fell in the 90s, there was a huge demand for American missionaries to come here. And so you saw a lot of Baptists and Pentecostals, a lot of evangelicals came here. There was a huge growth of faith, so much so that this is where missionaries are sent out from. So most of the post-Soviet republics, the Christian missionaries would be coming from Ukraine. We were actually with a missionary group yesterday that's sending missionaries to Mexico. Like they're still spreading the faith. But what you see in the occupied territories, Vladimir Putin controls the Russian Orthodox Church. It's another lever of his power. And when you control religion like that, part of it is for power, part of it is to stamp out faith. Faith is very disruptive for autocratic regimes. You imagine if you come in, you're an occupying power and you're trying to subdue the population and they report to God, they're really hard to control. And so if you can come and blow up the churches and kill the pastors, that is a mechanism of hope and faith, and it's disruptive. So if they can get rid of that, then they can control a lot easier. And that's really what we've seen is a generalized war on faith in this to achieve geopolitical ends of controlling those territories.
And Gary, let me add to that. Think about the role that the Catholic Church played in the fall of the Soviet Union. Think about Pope John Paul II. Mm-hmm. Think about, Catholic countries like Lithuania and Poland, and how the Catholic Church there threw off the yoke of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Vladimir Putin was active in working against the Catholic Church, against the overthrow of the Soviet Union. He remembers that. That's why, there's not a single Catholic priest in occupied Ukraine right now. And that's because Vladimir Putin knows the danger of free people of faith, people of strong faith.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Colby, to follow up, when I listened to this story from, I think one of the pastors in the documentary, it became very clear that this is not the story of the last 3 years or the last 14 years since Crimea. This is the story of Russia behavior in Ukraine for 100 years. Right. Isn't that right?
It is, yeah. And just looking at some of the statistics even recently, it's 47 faith leaders killed. That number just went to 49. The 630 churches that we talk about that were destroyed is now 650. So this is not only something that's gone on for hundreds of years, especially under Soviet times, but it's something that's accelerating. One thing we heard from some faith leaders there was, look, we've seen this playbook. We've seen the Soviet playbook. This feels a lot like this, but there is a level of brutality and just lack of humanity that's way worse than what we saw in the Soviet times. Soviet times, it was more like, well, we'll tear down the church. We'll try to influence the clergy. There wasn't as much like just outright torture and murder of pastors. One of the stories that sticks with me was we talked to a guy named Victor. He was an aid worker, and he was helping rescue a pregnant woman. He was captured by the Russians and tortured for 25 days. So he's in there for 25 days in a torture cell, repeatedly tortured by Russia. They brought in at one point a Russian Orthodox priest to cast out demons from him because he was a Protestant. And one of the things that one of our filmmakers said was, well, they were trying to convert him. And I was like, it's not it. There was no conversion. It was just torture and hate. How can we destroy this man? Thankfully, he was able to escape with the help of his wife, but just harrowing conversation with him.
Right. Yeah, Steve, I want to follow up on a point you just made. When it comes to the history of this fight, we know that historically the church has been a threat because the church follows God, not government. Yeah. So there is increasingly this effort by the Russian state. They only want a church sector that's active if they control it. So that leads to this big conflict in Ukraine, which Russian propaganda has really misconstrued amongst the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So can you unpack that a little bit more and really help put a block to this Russian propaganda that has confused so many, especially on our side here in the U.S.?
Well, I will start with this. I live in Ukraine. I've lived in Ukraine since day 5 of the war. And what you hear from Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, that Zelensky's persecuting Christians, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that is just not true. You just look around and you go, it's just not happening. Now, here's the kernel of truth in this piece of propaganda, because all good propaganda has a kernel of truth. There's the Russian Orthodox Church, as Colby mentioned, is a working arm of the Kremlin. Patriarch Kirill, their pope, recently declared a holy war on Ukraine and the West. My Bible doesn't have the word holy war in it, and Patriarch Kirill has said, if you die fighting in Ukraine, all your sins will be washed away. He stopped short of offering 72 virgins, but it's that same level of using, of militarizing religion to make martyrs. And so that's the Russian Orthodox Church. Now there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And this church reports to Patriarch Kirill. They've been reporting
in Moscow. Yeah.
Yeah. The clergy from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church reports to Patriarch Kirill in Moscow. And this is and not all these people in this church are bad actors, but there's dozens and dozens of clergy who are doing things like helping Russians target artillery, of like providing their church as a safe haven for Russian soldiers, preaching surrender. And so, this Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a spy network, for the Russians. And so 85% of Ukrainians see this church as a threat, as a national security threat. So,
as any American would, if there's a similar church operating here and reporting back to Moscow.
This is the same thing. We actually had this similar situation in the American Revolution. In an Anglican church, the bishops there swore an oath to God and to the king. The king was trying to destroy America. Continental Congress passed laws requiring that church to separate and sever its ties with England, and that's exactly what the Ukrainian government's doing. It's spun as they're banning this church. What they're saying is, you need to separate from Moscow. They're a geopolitical enemy that's trying to destroy us. Keep your church, do whatever you want. This is a religiously free society. You can't be affiliated with Moscow. And that gets spun into this concept that Zelensky's banning churches and these kind of things. So that's that kernel of truth that Stephen's talking about. Unfortunately, too many people in the U.S. have just swallowed that line without doing any real research. And so that was something that we wanted to address in the movie. Most of the movie, 90% of it, is really about what's happening to evangelical Christians at the hands of the Russians. But a lot of the people in America have heard this garbage from Tucker and others, saying that Zelensky is persecuting Christians. We wanted to address that so people actually
it was powerful to see that understood. The most powerful image, though, to me, was when you saw one of the Russian Orthodox priests, maybe it was Kirill himself, blessing with holy water the top of a Russian missile that would be fired at Ukraine, and then other, blessing tanks with holy water. And some have even called this this holy war an Orthodox jihad. It has some similarities to what we've seen in the Middle East. So I was glad to see you explain that and get into those details. And in fact, the Ukrainians have been embracing faith more and more. One of the things they did was they began to have chaplains in their military for the first time ever, and that came out in your documentary as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I would say there's really a tale of two cities here. So if you look at Russia back in 2010, Putin said that Russian Orthodoxy is closer to Islam than it is to Western Christianity, right? That was the first kind of concept where he's kind of trying to control and pervert this faith. And as a result, you look at weekly church attendance in Russia, it's like 3%. I mean, I wouldn't want to go to a church that was controlled by the state and was saying that you go to heaven if you die on the battlefield. And Russians are not going, right? So that there's that systematic destruction of faith and control of religion in Russia. Meanwhile, you start looking at what's happening in Ukraine. They just instituted a national day of prayer. They just instituted a national prayer breakfast. They created an entire chaplain corps and mandated now that every unit has a chaplain, right? This is a society that sees how impactful faith is in this struggle. I mean, look, back in 1991, they were still a communist country, right? And so to come that far, to having faith be outlawed, to go in and actually have national holidays for faith, a chaplain corps, and it's flourishing. What we saw in Ukraine, just the level of excitement around faith. One of the churches that we were talking to the pastor around, he said about 20% of his parishioners aren't Christians. They just come there for this message of faith and hope and resilience. And they see how these people are helping their community, defying the Russians, but also just, this sounds kind of maybe unusual, but actually praying for their enemy and really behaving in ways that are consistent with the first century Christians who were really.
And Steve, all of this is interdenominational. This is not just the Orthodox that are allowed and promoted to be chaplains and to be running the National Day of Prayer and those kinds of things. It's interdenominational.
Oh yeah, well the National Day of Prayer is run by a guy named Pavlo Ungurian, he's an evangelical Christian, and this is evangelical Christians make up about 4% of this country, but they have what's the word I'm looking for? It's an outsized influence,
right?
So
they bat above their weight.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and so these are people who faith is flourishing in a time of war, and it's remarkably seen. And and contrast that with Russia, and there's this perception that Putin is some sort of defender of Christendom. He's like, riding, into battle shirtless on the back of a horse, waving a sword, and trying to protect Christianity. And he's not. And in addition, if you just got to look at what Russia is like as a country, it's got some of the highest rates of suicide in the world, highest rates of abortion in the world. It's got some of the highest rates of divorce in the world, and
alcoholism.
Yeah, and they spend as much on the occult, like fortune tellers, psychic readers, that sort of thing, as they do on groceries. So there's nothing really, and as Colby pointed out, only 3% of them go to church weekly. So it's a miserable place to live on any number of scales. And, Vladimir Putin is the reason.
I think that's what you see with these stats is when you try to wipe out faith, you also wipe out hope. And that's where you see this come up in terms of divorce rates and alcoholism, and this kind of turn towards astrology and these kind of things is like when you really put your boot on faith, hope drops too. And that's what we're seeing in Russia. And it's the opposite in Ukraine.
Yeah. And that's the real picture that Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Marjorie Taylor Greene don't understand, or if they do, they're suppressing for whatever reasons that are beyond me. But getting back to this documentary, folks can go to faithundersiege.com. They can view it today for free. It came out, though, just a couple weeks ago. Tell us how this rollout has gone. And I guess you've been traveling around the country, around the world as part of this big push to share the good news.
One of the great things that happened is as we started putting this documentary out there was the faith community and the media community really jumped on this. So CBN was our anchor partner. They played it 6 times. It then went to Newsmax. We're doing a special with TBN. So really just an amazing pickup. Salem jumped on there. So really the plan was really to get it to all kinds of places so people could see it in their own format. But really one of the big pillars too is like church screenings. That's something that we really feel we want people to see the movie, but it's so much more impactful if they can see it with a group. So either their church or community group or civic organization. We've got extra content. Stephen and I will zoom in, or if we're in the area, we'll come by.
If you like what you're seeing now, you can have more of it.
That's right. So we just showed it in Odessa. I'm going to show it. We're showing it at a church in Kyiv tomorrow. Really just getting that out there. But the embrace of this movie amongst the people that we've shown it to has just been fantastic, and really some hearts and minds changed on this. The comments that come back are, some variation of, I had no idea, this totally changed my mind on the subject, and everybody needs to see this, or Tucker needs to see this, or whatever. And so, but just that sense of like, thank you for the, firsthand stories here, for a fulsome accounting of what's really going on. This blew my mind. This doesn't match with all the TikTok garbage that I've seen, but like, this makes sense, and this changed my mind. And that's really what we're trying to do. Christians in America, Americans, they're good people. You give them good information, they're going to make good decisions. The problem is they've been fed this steady diet of garbage on the subject. And this is a way, I think, to set the record straight. And as Stephen likes to say, the truth still works. You get the truth out there in a consumable format, people make good decisions. So
yes, Steve, Colby, as we begin to close out, I'd love to hear from each of you, maybe Steve first. What's the most powerful story that came out of this, either on camera or maybe off camera, something you all experienced in the making of this documentary? So Steve first, and then Colby.
Yeah, sure. Listen, I have a very good friend. His name is Victor. And Colby alluded to his story just a minute ago. And he's the reason that all of us here are talking right now. It's because Victor came up to me in a co-working facility in Kyiv in 2022 and said, "Hi, my name is Victor. I'm an evangelical Christian." All right, dude. Our evangelical Christians aren't quite that evangelical, but what do you got? And so he starts telling me that he says, I was, again, he was in Luhansk. He was an evangelical Christian, volunteering, getting people out of occupied Ukraine. And the Russians pulled him over one day, pulled him out of his truck, and took him to the basement, which is a euphemism for being tortured. And they tortured him for 25 days, including one day when they were torturing him with an electrical taser, and there was a Russian Orthodox priest standing over him and trying to cast demons out of him for being an evangelical Christian. They heard him praying. And so they did this to him. And, that was just just completely short-circuited my brain to hear this. I was like, and I didn't know what to do with it. But ultimately, we started talking to members of Congress, and we started talking, to the media and trying to get the story out. And so Colby came along, and Victor's story is one of the stories we told. And that is the first story I heard. It is still the most profound story that impacts me. And Victor is right now at the front. He's a drone pilot. He was a chaplain, and he just got tired of seeing the Russians do what they're doing. And so he decided the best thing he could do is fight back.
Yeah. Amazing. Just Victor's story, that moment in the basement, who knew that God would use that for good and bring this documentary to the screens of millions. Colby, how about for you?
Yeah, one of the stories I tell is like, if you were a basketball fan and you got the chance to go play a pickup game with LeBron James, like that's what it felt like being a Christian and going to Ukraine and being with these folks, just heroes of our faith. And Serhiy Haidarzi is the one that jumps out to me. Serhiy Haidarzi was in Odessa, the town I'm in right now. An Iranian Shahed drone was launched by Russia. It hit his apartment building and killed his wife and 4-month-old son. We met Serhiy Haidarzi just after that. He was actually a little late to the filming because he was doing humanitarian aid up in Kherson. The level of faith that this man exuded was something that just blew my mind. And we actually interviewed him a second time, and then we saw him a third time because we were in Kryvyi Rih, which is President Zelensky's hometown.
Yeah.
So he gets hit a lot. And there was another evangelical father who a Russian drone came in and killed his wife and 3 children. Serhiy Haidarzi was asked to speak at his funeral. And I'll never forget what Serhiy said. He said, we cannot let hatred consume our hearts. Revenge is for the Lord. We need to be dependent on him to right these wrongs. Can you imagine that? Like, you lost your wife, you lost your son at the hands of an enemy that's trying to destroy not just your country, but your faith, your language, your very essence. And then you're speaking at a father's funeral. It's the same thing happened, and your message is one of forgiveness and dependence on your faith. These kind of things, like we have it so easy in America. It is so safe. It is so easy that we squabble amongst ourselves, and I think seeing these kind of stories really grounds us back to, there's all kinds of politics and these kind of things. This is about real Christians losing their lives in a conflict that should have never happened.
Yeah. And I will add to that story just for a second. You may have met Serhiy because he was one of the Ukrainian Christians who came to Washington, D.C. like 3 weeks after his wife and child were killed by an Iranian drone in his home. He went to Washington, D.C., and he talked to Speaker Johnson and relayed the story and gave, and the stories like those gave Speaker Johnson an emotional and spiritual connection to Ukraine that gave him the motivation to put his job on the line as the third most powerful American and pass that aid bill last April.
Yep, that's exactly right, Steve. Serhiy's story impacted Speaker Johnson, and that changed the course of history. Just as, your friend Victor's story changed the course of history and has brought Faith Under Siege to the screen. faithundersiege.com. Folks can go there today, watch for free. They can watch with their home groups, church groups, any group. I highly recommend it. Top quality production value. All real, no actors, and you guys did a tremendous job. Thank you so much for being here today, sharing that on Peace and Power Ukraine, and we'll continue to pray for more Ukrainian heroes like Serhiy to be able to stand up, and like Victor to be able to continue on in this fight. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, because what you're doing is really important and very valuable. And Colby and I and every Ukrainian that's here around us appreciates what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you again. We appreciate it. And until next time, we'll see you back on these new front lines in the media war.